Hi. Back again to the film's storyline. The film begins with a woman named Lewis. At that time she is dressing up to go to work. She herself works as head of arts at Columbia University. When she was in the office, she looked very lonely because she had just separated from her husband, Peter. However, even though she has separated, she still communicates well with Peter. It can be seen that during break times they still chat well. Sin returned to the office where at that time she received an envelope containing a job application letter for an assistant position, and because she also needed an assistant, she immediately called the applicant. And the applicant's name was Scott. He asked Scott to come for an interview on Monday afternoon and also bring his art files for him to look at. On her way home from work, she stopped by her mother's house, and there she took a box which contained a painting of a man from her past. And it turned out that the painting was her ex-boyfriend when she was still in high school, and it was also seen that the painting box had the same name on it. The same as the name of the job applicant, namely Scott. A few days later on Monday, she was seen dressed up beautifully to welcome Scott's arrival, and at that time she waited too long for Scott to come, and she then called her friend named Messi who was a vacancy admin in her office to ask where Scott was. But his friend actually teased Lewis by saying that Scott had disappeared 20 years ago. Because he was annoyed at being teased, he hung up the phone. And a few moments later Scott came with his painting file, and Lewis examined the painting file carefully. After Lewis examined Scott's painting, he offered to let Scott stop by his apartment and chat about his painting. And it looks like she invited Scott to her apartment because she wanted to do that to Scott. And while there they talked while drinking beer, and during that conversation Scott asked if she had ever been painted without clothes. Lewis then answered that he had once been painted without clothes on, and Scott's purpose in asking that was because he wanted to paint Lewis without clothes on, and at that time Lewis could only smile embarrassedly after Scott said that. And after Scott asked that, he dared to touch Lewis's body, which made him want to do that right now, and they started making love. Lewis, who hadn't done that for a long time, felt alive again when Scoot's banana entered his cave. After they sweated together, Lewis said that he wanted to do it again in the future, and Scott then said he was ready whenever Lewis needed his banana. After they did that, she then changed her clothes because the clothes she was wearing were wrinkled from playing too rough with Scott. And at that time Scoot called his mother to just ask how his mother was, and it seemed that Scoot really loved his mother, which made Lewis fall in love with Scoot even more. The next day Lewis called Messi and said that he was very happy because he had just met a man who was younger than him, and he also said that now he had found his passion in life again after not feeling love for several years. And Lewis's cheerfulness was also known by Peter, his ex-husband, who also knew that Lewis had just started a relationship with a man. And their conversation continued in Lewis's apartment. There Peter told everyone that he had actually cheated on her when they were still married. Peter also talked about and admitted that he had a relationship with Lois's younger brother who was a man. Hearing this, Lewis was angry because he felt that he had been cheated by Peter when they were still married, and at that time Lewis kicked Peter out of his apartment. The next day Scott came to Lewis's apartment again, and there Scott asked about Lewis's angry face, and he said that he was only angry with Peter, his ex-husband. Hearing this, Scott then said that he would never make Lewis angry and promised to make him happy. And to make Lewis happy again, Scott invited Lewis to go to a bar, and there Scott gave some sweet words to make Lewis smile again, so that because he was carried away by the atmosphere, they ended up kissing. And a few moments later Scott's friend came over to them. There Scott's friend said that Scott was a playboy and Scott had just broken a woman's heart. But at that time Lewis didn't care about Scott's friend's words, which he thought weren't true. And Lewis then asked Scott about his friend Messi. Lewis asked about Scoot who came to Messi's house when they had never known each other. Scott then said that he went to Messi's house just to find out more about Lewis, because he knew that Messi had been Lewis's friend since high school. After hearing that, Lewis became even more convinced that Scott really loved him, and after that they went back to the apartment to do it again. And before they did it, Lewis asked Scott to look in the mirror because he wanted to imagine that Scott was her husband. And after Lewis imagined that, they then did it again to enjoy Louise's bananas. The next morning Lewis woke up from his sleep alone and he saw that Scott was no longer in his apartment, so he assumed that Scott had left him and was just being used as a toy by Scott. Luis, who at that time felt sad because he had been abandoned by Scoot, then went to his mother's house, and there she cried next to her mother, saying that her day was ruined because there were no more men approaching her. And Lewis there also met his younger brother, and he then asked about his younger brother's relationship with Peter, which could have happened at that time. And Lewis's younger brother also said that when Lewis was with Peter, he was too busy with his work, which made Peter lonely, and in that loneliness, Peter paid himself to fight bananas. And after she cried to her mother and asked her sister, she then went to Messie's house and there she asked where Scott was, but instead of telling her where Scott was, Messie instead said that Scott was not satisfied with Lewis, so Scott came to him and they played together. Hearing that, Luis became angry with Messie, who was his best friend, who had done that to Scott, and he then left Messie's house while looking disappointed on his face. After leaving the machine's house, she then went home to her apartment and at that time she saw Scott, who was waiting for her in front of her apartment. And because he was annoyed, Lewis asked about Scott's relationship with the machine, and Scott answered that it was the machine's wish and not his own. Lewis, who was angry at that time, went into his own apartment without inviting Scoot to come in with him. When he was in the apartment, it turned out that Peter was already there, and Peter came to apologize because he actually still loved Lewis. The next day Scott came to Lewis's apartment, there he saw Peter, who was also there. And a fight broke out between them, because at that time they actually still wanted Lewis. But at that time Peter relented and he then left Lewis's apartment. When they were alone, there Lewis and Scott fought because Scott was jealous because Lewis was still bringing Peter into his apartment. At that time, Lewis said that they weren't doing anything in his apartment, and Scott, who at that time still hadn't received Lewis's answer, then left Lewis. The next day Lewis came to Messie again, and there Messie cornered Lewis again. Messie said that Scott would definitely come back but not for Lewis, but instead came to Messie, and Messie said again that since high school he had always won when it came to romance with Lewis. And after she said that, she told the truth, namely that she and Scott had been making plans for Lewis so that she would fight to find her true love and not fail in love again. Hearing the words of the machine who had planned all this, she then felt relieved and she became enthusiastic again to pursue her love, and she also promised to care about herself. The next day, she improved her life by exercising and managing her time well. And she also came to Peter to say that now they don't have any relationship anymore and she wants to forget Peter. At the end of the film, Lewis is seen attending an exhibition of paintings made by Scott, and now Scott has been accepted to work at the university as Lewis's assistant. At that time, Scott thanked Lewis because he was able to work at the university thanks to his help. However, at that time, Lewis said that the achievements he had now were the result of his own work and there was no interference from Lewis. After that they walked together and they stopped briefly to kiss on the university field and the film ended. Thank you for watching the storyline of the film that I have presented. I hope you enjoy it and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. See you in the next video.